April 1945, Berlin. The city was dying. Bombs fell like endless rain. The sky was a burning wound, and the streets were filled with whispers of surrender. Inside a shattered university lab, one man worked under candlelight, surrounded by glass, smoke, and silence. His name was Dr. Heinrich Vollmer, once a proud Nazi scientist, now a man haunted by what he'd built. While the Reich collapsed outside, he was preparing something that could end the suffering, not prolong it. A man trained to destroy was now trying to save the very people he was ordered to kill. That irony kept him awake for 72 straight hours. His hands shook, not from fear, but from guilt. He knew the Allies were only days away. The SS had begun executing anyone showing signs of betrayal. Yet Vollmer didn't stop. Each test tube, each chemical note he scribbled, was another act of defiance against the monster he had helped create. He wasn't working on weapons anymore. He was trying to make a cure. For what? For the gas he himself had designed. The gas that was still killing soldiers and civilians across Europe. And if discovered, his execution would be immediate. Still, he stayed. The sound of distant artillery mixed with the faint crackle of his radio. Broken, but enough to tell him the end was near. Berlin will fall within the week, it whispered. But Vollmer didn't care. He wanted redemption, even if it meant dying before the world saw what he'd done. Once his experiments had earned him medals. Now they'd get him shot. The irony wasn't lost on him. In that crumbling lab, he wrote his final note. For those I could not save. He placed it in a metal drawer next to his last vial. A clear antidote for a weapon that never should have existed. Outside, the night was filled with chaos. Soldiers running, officers shouting, fires consuming archives and lives alike. Somewhere above, Hitler hid in his bunker, writing fantasies of victory while the real Germany bled beneath him. Vollmer looked at a photograph of his wife, gone since 1942, and whispered to it as if she could hear him. I made monsters. Now let me try to unmake one. The walls trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. A soldier burst through the door, an SS lieutenant, pistol drawn, eyes wild. Doctor, orders from above, destroy all materials. Vollmer didn't move. The lieutenant approached, saw the vials, the documents, the formulas. What is this? He demanded. Vollmer looked up slowly. An apology, he said. That single word made the officer hesitate. A heartbeat later, the sound of another explosion drowned the room. The lights flickered, and the lieutenant fell, shrapnel in his chest. Vollmer knelt beside him, his face grim. Even as death surrounded him, he tried to help, tearing his coat, pressing it to the man's wound. The irony again, saving one who came to kill him. Don't move, he whispered. It'll pass soon. But it wouldn't. Not for him, not for Berlin, not for any of them. In the distance, the thunder of Soviet tanks rolled closer. Vollmer stood, clutching his antidote. The one pure thing he'd made in years of madness. Maybe he couldn't save a nation, but he could leave behind a chance. Somewhere beyond the fire, beyond the hatred, there were still lives worth saving. He turned toward the window, smoke blurring his view of the city he once believed in. So this is how it ends, he murmured. Not with a victory, but with a choice. By dawn, Berlin was unrecognizable. A skeleton of what used to be the heart of an empire. Smoke hung over the ruins like a second sky. Dr. Heinrich Vollmer moved through the corridors of the half-destroyed institute, clutching a small metal case against his chest. Inside, it was his final experiment, a neutralizing agent that, if mass-produced, could undo the damage of his own creation. But there was no one left to trust, no system left to save it. The men he once called colleagues had either fled or turned into fanatics. To them, surrender was worse than death. To him, surrender was redemption. Each step echoed through the empty hallways, past portraits of generals and flags now covered in dust. His boots crunched over broken glass, and papers marked with the seal of the Reich. He paused beside a laboratory door. Its plaque burned black. He ran his fingers over it. Once his name had been engraved there in gold. He had believed in progress, in science as a path to strength. But that belief had been twisted into horror. He remembered 1939. The speeches, the applause, the promise of a new Germany. He remembered how it felt to be needed, how easily men like him were seduced by purpose. "Serve your country," they said. And he did, until his country became a graveyard. Outside, a loudspeaker crackled with the voice of Joseph Goebbels, still preaching faith in victory. Vollmer turned it off. He'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. In a nearby room, he found a map still pinned to the wall. Red markers circling cities that no longer existed. He took it down and folded it carefully, as if burying a body. Then he looked at his antidote, the glass vial shimmering faintly in the light. Its formula was incomplete, but it worked in theory. All it needed was stability testing, something he'd never get time to finish. The front line was less than 5 kilometers away. Soviet artillery shells landed closer by the hour. Vollmer's lab assistant, a young boy barely 19, entered the room holding a pistol. "They're evacuating civilians to the west," he said nervously. "You should come." Vollmer shook his head. "No. Someone has to stay and make sure this isn't lost." The boy hesitated, then handed him a photograph. A group of prisoners from Dachau, emaciated, broken, but alive. "They said this gas was mercy," the boy whispered. "It wasn't." Vollmer's jaw tightened. "I know," he said. "That's why I can't run." Moments later, the building shook violently, a direct hit nearby. The boy was thrown off balance, and the antidote case nearly fell from Vollmer's grasp. He caught it just in time. "Go!" he shouted. "Get out while you can!" The assistant hesitated once more, then fled down the corridor. Alone again, Vollmer looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror. A man stripped of rank, purpose, and illusion. "You wanted to play God," he told himself softly. "Now you can beg him for forgiveness." He opened the case one last time, checking the vial. The liquid shimmered like light trapped in glass. Maybe someday someone would find it. Maybe they'd finish what he started. Outside, the artillery fire grew louder. The floor quaked. Papers flew like white birds in the wind. Vollmer turned toward the sound. Calm now. Almost peaceful. He wasn't saving himself. He was saving the idea that even monsters could choose to change. "Let history decide what I was," he murmured. He placed the vial into a lead box, sealed it tight, and hid it beneath the floorboards marked with a cross. As the walls began to collapse around him, he sat down at his desk, pen in hand, and wrote his final entry. "If anyone finds this, let it stand as proof that knowledge without conscience is death." I was a servant of both. Then, for the first time in years, he smiled. Before the fall of Berlin, before the madness swallowed everything, Dr. Heinrich Vollmer had been one of the Reich's brightest minds. Born in Munich in 1901, he was the son of a schoolteacher and a chemist. His fascination with science started early, long before the swastika replaced the German flag. In the 1920s, when his country was still gasping from the wounds of the Great War, Vollmer believed science could heal it. He studied at Heidelberg, then joined the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where breakthroughs in biology and chemistry were reshaping the modern world. He wasn't a soldier or a politician. He was a man chasing discovery. But when the Nazis rose to power, science became a weapon, and men like Vollmer became soldiers in white coats. At first, he convinced himself it was for the greater good. Research into better medicine, faster healing agents for the wounded. That's how it always began. Then came the military contracts, the requests for experiments on captured prisoners, the orders written in black ink but signed with blood. He told himself he had no choice. Everyone said that. By 1941, he was transferred to a secret facility outside Leipzig, working under the code name Project Nebel. Its goal was to develop a faster, deadlier chemical agent for trench warfare. Vollmer didn't invent the idea, he perfected it. He created the compound that became known as Agent Z13, a gas that didn't just suffocate, it paralyzed. Victims remained conscious for minutes after exposure, unable to scream, unable to die. He watched the tests in silence, the screams echoing in his skull long after the chambers were cleared. The SS officers called it a masterpiece. Vollmer called it damnation. Yet he stayed. Fear kept him loyal. Ambition kept him quiet. But something in him began to fracture after he received a letter in late 1942. His wife, Anna, had died in an air raid over Hamburg. Her last words, scrawled in the corner of the letter, read, "Remember who you are." That line became the beginning of his rebellion. He started falsifying reports, delaying shipments, sabotaging batches. Slowly, secretly, he began altering the formula. Less lethal, more reversible. It was dangerous, suicidal even, but each small act gave him back a piece of his humanity. His assistants noticed his behavior changing. The once proud, confident doctor now walked with eyes sunken and voice trembling. He avoided SS briefings, stayed alone in his lab. By 1944, his reputation had begun to crumble. Rumors spread that he'd lost faith in the cause. The military reassigned him to Berlin, a demotion disguised as honor. There, under constant surveillance, he was ordered to develop a countermeasure against Allied gas attacks that didn't exist. Irony again. They wanted him to build protection against a weapon they themselves unleashed. But in that twisted order, Vollmer saw an opening. He could turn the research back on itself, make a real antidote. He gathered stolen notes, scraps of formulas, pieces of data he'd hidden for years. When Allied bombers began their raids over Berlin, most scientists fled the capital. Vollmer stayed. He told his remaining assistants, "We started this nightmare. We'll end it here." The younger ones didn't understand. The older ones were too afraid. Soon he was alone. The lab became both a prison and a sanctuary. Nights blurred into days. Outside, the city collapsed. Inside, he was racing against both death and discovery. The SS kept visiting, demanding progress reports. Each time he handed them falsified data, harmless compounds, meaningless words. But behind their backs, he worked on his greatest act of defiance. Not a poison, but a cure. By early 1945, the illusion of Nazi invincibility had shattered. Soviet forces were closing in from the east, the Allies from the west, and Berlin had become a graveyard of ideals. Within the ruins of the city, Dr. Heinrich Vollmer continued his secret work inside the gutted remains of the Berlin Science Institute. What had once been a temple of innovation was now a fortress of desperation, a place where truth was buried under propaganda and fear. Vollmer's lab was one of the few still functioning, powered by stolen fuel and candlelight. He spent his nights testing compounds on lab rats, tracking results in coded notebooks that even the SS couldn't decipher. He disguised the antidote's ingredients as nerve suppressants, ensuring any inspections would see nothing unusual. Every vial, every note, every reaction was a silent act of rebellion. He no longer wore his uniform. The armband, the medals, the insignia, all locked away in a drawer. In their place, a tattered white coat stained by smoke and chemicals. To his colleagues, he had gone mad. To himself, he had finally gone sane. His research focused on reversing nerve agent reactions, a concept the regime found pointless since true Germans never needed saving. But Vollmer pressed on, convinced that redemption could still come through science. He had one confidant, Dr. Elsa Reinhardt, a biologist he had mentored before the war. She returned to Berlin after losing her brother on the Eastern Front, broken but still loyal to knowledge. Together, they shared a silent understanding. Their work wasn't about victory anymore. It was about repentance. "We built monsters," Elsa whispered one night, as artillery thundered in the distance. Then let's build something human again, Volmer replied. The walls shook, glass shattered, but they kept working. When supplies ran out, they scavenged from abandoned hospitals. When chemicals were gone, they distilled substitutes from burnt debris. Even in the heart of destruction, they created something meant to save lives. Volmer's formula was nearly complete. A neutralizing compound capable of reversing paralysis and repairing cellular nerve damage. He called it Regenserum, from the German word for renewal. Yet he knew the irony. His redemption would come too late to save those who'd already died because of him. Outside their lab, chaos grew. Hitler's speeches turned from triumph to rage. Civilians fled, soldiers deserted, and the SS began purging anyone showing weakness. One by one, Volmer's old colleagues disappeared. Some were executed for defeatism, others simply vanished. The Gestapo paid him visits too, suspicious of his silence. Each time, he handed them falsified progress charts showing meaningless equations. He smiled, saluted, and waited for them to leave before continuing his real work. One night, Elsa came to him trembling. "They're destroying all research not linked to the war effort," she said. "They'll come for us next." Volmer nodded. "Then we finish before they do." In the final week of April, Elsa managed to smuggle the last of their notes out of the building, hidden inside medical supplies destined for a field hospital. "If I don't return," she told him, "make sure this isn't lost." She never came back. Volmer waited 2 days, then 3. On the 4th, he found a blood-stained armband near the checkpoint where she'd last been seen. He didn't cry. There was no time left for mourning. Instead, he poured every remaining moment into finalizing the serum. His hands were blistered, his lungs filled with smoke, but his focus never broke. The city outside roared with the sound of collapsing empires, but inside that lab, a single man fought to reclaim his soul. He knew he wouldn't live to see peace, but if one life could be saved from what he had unleashed, then maybe, just maybe, history would forgive him. April 26, 1945, Berlin was surrounded. The Soviets had breached the eastern districts. Artillery shook the ground like thunder from hell, and the Reich was devouring itself from within. Inside the collapsing Science Institute, Dr. Heinrich Volmer worked under the glow of a single lamp, his breath fogging in the cold. He had just hours left. The last functional power lines had been cut. His instruments flickered and died one by one. Still, he refused to stop. On the desk before him sat the completed vial of Regenserum, his final act of defiance against a regime he'd once served. But the real conflict wasn't just outside his walls. It was inside his mind. For every test he'd completed, there was a face he remembered from the chambers of Leipzig, from the gas trials he'd once overseen. Every successful reaction now felt like an apology whispered too late. "You think this will make you a hero?" his conscience asked him. "No," he answered aloud, voice hollow. "But maybe it'll make me human again." The lab door rattled with a knock. 2 sharp, 1 long. The signal of the SS. Volmer froze. He quickly hid the vial inside his coat and opened the door to find Major Dieter Brandt, his former commanding officer, standing in the hallway, uniform immaculate despite the chaos. "Doctor," Brandt said, his tone almost casual, "I heard you've been working on something special." Volmer forced a smile. "A defense serum, sir, for our soldiers." Brandt stepped inside, eyeing the cluttered desk, the flickering lights, the coded notes. "At this stage of the war?" He sneered. "You expect me to believe that?" Volmer said nothing. The major picked up one of the vials, examined it, and placed it down. "You were a patriot once, Heinrich. Now you look like a ghost." His words cut deep. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're trying to wash the blood off your hands. But there's no redemption for men like us." Volmer's jaw tightened. "Maybe not," he said. "But that doesn't mean I'll die serving the same lie." The major's smile vanished. He drew his pistol, leveling it at Volmer's chest. Careful, Doctor. The Führer still values obedience. In that moment, the tension between them wasn't just political, it was personal. They had started this journey together. Two men of science turned instruments of war, but one had surrendered his conscience, and the other was fighting to reclaim it. You used to believe in the Reich's future, Brandt said. I believed in its people, Vollmer replied. Not in the madness that consumed them. The major cocked his gun. Outside, the building shook again. A Soviet shell had landed nearby, blowing out half the windows. Dust rained from the ceiling. Vollmer didn't move. Shoot me then, he said quietly. But the moment you do, this formula dies with me. The war you're fighting will swallow us both. For a moment, the major hesitated. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from doubt. Vollmer saw it in his eyes, the flicker of humanity, buried beneath years of loyalty and lies. You think history will forgive you? Brandt whispered. Vollmer looked straight at him. I don't care about history. I care about tomorrow. Another explosion ripped through the floor below, shaking the walls. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, Vollmer heard a single shot, but not toward him. The major had fired at the wall, cursing under his breath. Get out, he spat, before I change my mind. Vollmer didn't wait. He grabbed his notes, his coat, and the serum, running into the smoke-filled corridor. Behind him, the lab burst into flames from a ruptured gas line. He didn't look back. Every step he took echoed with a strange mix of fear and freedom. He was no longer a scientist serving orders. He was a fugitive carrying the only thing that could cleanse his sins. But in Berlin that week, there was no safe place left to hide. The next morning, the city woke to fire and silence. Berlin's heart had stopped beating. Dr. Heinrich Vollmer moved through streets littered with rubble, bodies, and propaganda leaflets fluttering like ash. He kept the small metal case pressed tightly under his arm. The last vial of Regan serum, the only proof of his redemption. But danger followed every echo of his footsteps. SS patrols roamed the ruins, executing deserters and traitors. Civilians hid in basements, praying for the war's end. Above them, the sky was streaked with smoke and Soviet artillery flashes. Vollmer's only thought was escape, not for himself, but for the formula. If he could get it to Allied hands, perhaps it would survive him. But Berlin was a maze of fear and fire. Every bridge had been destroyed, every route guarded. He slipped through an alley behind the Reich Chancellery, past a wall covered in bullet holes, where the graffiti read, in red paint, Der Krieg ist verloren. The war is lost. He stopped for a moment, staring at those words. Not yet, he whispered. Not until I do this right. He ducked into an abandoned clinic, once run by the Red Cross before the Gestapo seized it. Inside, the smell of medicine and decay mixed with smoke. He found a working light and sat beside a desk, spreading his documents. The serum's stability still worried him. Exposure to cold could alter its molecular structure. He had to keep it warm. He tore his coat, wrapped the vial, and held it close to his chest. That's when he heard footsteps. 3 SS soldiers entered the hallway. Their boots echoed sharply, deliberate and slow. "Search everything!" one shouted. "No one leaves this sector alive." Vollmer froze, gripping the vial tighter. The soldiers moved room to room, kicking doors, smashing furniture. One entered the clinic, flashlight beams sweeping across the floor. It stopped on the metal case near his feet. "You there!" The soldier raised his weapon. Vollmer stood slowly, hands shaking. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice calm. "You're a coward," the soldier spat. "Orders are clear. All scientists are to report for reassignment to the bunker." Vollmer knew what that meant. Execution under the guise of reassignment. The soldier stepped forward. But before he could fire, the sound of distant tank engines rumbled through the streets. The Soviet army had arrived. A shell hit the building next door, blowing the windows inward. The soldier screamed as debris crushed him. Volmer dropped to the ground, crawling beneath the desk. Smoke filled the air. The two remaining soldiers fled, their shouts fading into chaos. He lay there, coughing, trembling, clutching the serum to his chest like it was his heartbeat. When the shaking stopped, he stood and looked outside. Soviet infantry were advancing down Wilhelmstrasse, their red flags fluttering through the haze. For the first time in years, Volmer felt no loyalty, no allegiance, only exhaustion. He stepped back into the clinic, knowing he couldn't just surrender. They would never understand what he carried. To them, he was still an enemy, a war criminal in a stolen coat. He needed a witness, someone who could vouch for what this serum truly meant. He thought of Elsa Reinhardt, her last words before vanishing. "Make sure this isn't lost." He had to find someone like her, someone who still believed in humanity amid the ruins. Hours passed as he searched the district, weaving through wreckage and bodies. Then, near the Brandenburg Gate, he saw them. A group of medics treating wounded civilians, wearing makeshift armbands with red crosses drawn in ink. He approached cautiously. A young nurse, face smudged with soot, looked up. "You're hurt," she said. He shook his head. "Not me, but I have something that can save others." She frowned. "Save them? From what?" Volmer opened the case just enough for her to see the glass vial, glowing faintly in the light. "From what we became," he said. For a long moment, she just stared. Then she nodded. "Come with us, doctor." It was the first time anyone had called him that without contempt in years. They moved underground, into the remains of a subway station turned into a makeshift hospital. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the metallic sting of blood. Children cried in corners, soldiers moaned on stretchers, and candles flickered against cracked tiles that once gleamed white. Volmer followed the nurse, her name was Clara, as she guided him through rows of wounded civilians. "We don't have enough medicine," she said softly. "Not even morphine. The Soviets are closing in. We treat who we can." He nodded, scanning the chaos. These weren't soldiers. They were mothers, old men, children, the very people his science was meant to protect, not destroy. Clara pointed to an empty table near the back. "You can work here." Volmer unwrapped the vial, the soft glow illuminating his trembling hands. "This," he said, "can accelerate cellular regeneration. It could close wounds, stop infection, if it works." Clara stared, uncertain. "If it works?" "It was never tested on the living," he confessed. "Not properly. My superiors wanted it for something else." She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. He drew a syringe, carefully extracting a drop. A young boy lay nearby, a shrapnel wound tearing through his abdomen. His mother wept silently beside him. Volmer hesitated only a moment before injecting the serum near the wound. For a second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the bleeding stopped. The tissue began to tighten, the edges knitting together as if time itself reversed. Clara gasped. "My God!" Volmer's hands shook. "No," he whispered. "Not God, just guilt." Within minutes, the boy opened his eyes, weak but alive. His mother fell to her knees, clutching Volmer's coat, sobbing. Word spread quickly through the station. People whispered, "A Nazi doctor healing the dying." Some called it a miracle, others a trick. Volmer ignored them. He worked tirelessly, treating whoever he could, rationing every drop of the serum. Each success filled him with equal parts relief and dread. Redemption was addictive and dangerous. "Doctor," Clara said later, bringing him a small tin cup of water. "Why help us? You could have fled." He looked at her for a long time before answering. Because I spent years trying to make death efficient. I owe life a debt. Outside, the ground trembled again. Soviet artillery struck closer, shaking dust from the ceiling. "They'll find us soon," Clara said. "We need to move." Volmer gathered his notes, his instruments, and the half-empty vial. But before they could leave, a new voice echoed through the tunnels. Harsh. Familiar. "Dr. Volmer!" A man stepped from the shadows. SS Colonel Riedel, his former superior. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with ash, but his eyes still burned with fanatic purpose. "You're alive," Riedel said, almost smiling. "I knew you wouldn't betray science." Volmer stiffened. "You betrayed everything else." The colonel raised his pistol. "Hand over the formula. The Führer may be gone, but our vision isn't." Clara stepped in front of Volmer, trembling. "He's saving people. You can't—" Riedel struck her across the face, knocking her down. Volmer's rage finally broke. "You've killed enough," he said. "No more." Riedel aimed at him. "You were my best scientist. Don't make me end you like the rest." Volmer stared into the barrel, then slowly lifted his hands, not to surrender, but to hold up the glowing vial. "You want this?" he said quietly. "Then catch." He hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, releasing a mist that shimmered in the dim light. Riedel cursed, stepping back, coughing. The chemical reacted instantly with the air, forming a dense fog that spread through the station. Volmer grabbed Clara and pulled her toward the exit. Behind them, Riedel fired wildly, his shots echoing through the chaos. Civilians screamed, scattering as the fog thickened. By the time the smoke cleared, Volmer and Clara were gone, swallowed by the ruins above. The city above was unrecognizable, a wasteland of broken glass and burning streets. Volmer and Clara moved through the rubble like ghosts, stepping over collapsed staircases and charred furniture. The distant thunder of Soviet tanks rolled, closer each minute, their searchlights cutting through the smoke like accusing eyes. "Where will we go?" Clara whispered. "There's nowhere left." Volmer didn't answer. He scanned the horizon, east, west, all the same, fire and death. "There's one place," he finally said, "the university. My lab might still have notes, formulas that could help us make more serum." They reached the building just before dawn. The main hall was half destroyed, the ceiling caved in, books scattered like autumn leaves. Volmer's footsteps echoed through the corridor until they reached his old laboratory door. The brass nameplate, Dr. Heinrich Volmer, was blackened by soot. Inside, the place was frozen in time. Papers still covered the tables, test tubes filled with dust, and a cracked photograph of a woman and 2 children, his wife and daughters, smiled faintly from the corner. Clara picked it up gently. "Your family?" He nodded, his voice low. "Gone since 1943. Allied bombs." She placed it back down, her eyes soft. "Then this isn't about guilt anymore. It's about peace." Volmer gave a faint smile. "Peace is earned, not given." He began gathering what was left of his research: chemical formulas, half-burned notebooks, a few surviving vials. "If I can replicate it," he said, "we might save the wounded, maybe even rebuild." But before he could continue, the heavy slam of boots echoed from the hallway. Clara froze. "They found us!" The door burst open. Soviet soldiers, weapons raised. Their commander stepped forward, shouting in Russian. Volmer raised his hands. "We're not armed," Clara translated quickly, begging them to listen. One soldier aimed directly at Volmer's chest. "He's a Nazi," another growled in German. "He dies." "No," Clara cried. "He's saving people, civilians, not soldiers." The commander hesitated, scanning the lab. His gaze fell on the shattered vials, the glowing residue on the floor. "What is this?" Volmer took a breath. "A cure," he said. "For wounds, infection, death itself, perhaps." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The commander motioned for his men to lower their guns. "Prove it," he demanded. Volmer turned to Clara. Her sleeve was torn, blood seeping from a fresh cut on her arm. He drew a drop from one remaining vial and applied it gently. Within moments, the bleeding stopped. The skin knitted back together. The soldiers stepped back, murmuring in disbelief. The commander's expression shifted, suspicion turning to curiosity, then to greed. "You will come with us," he said. "The Red Army will reward you." Volmer's stomach tightened. He had traded one evil for another. "No," he said firmly. "This work isn't for armies anymore." The commander smiled coldly. "You don't have a choice." He raised his pistol, signaling his men to seize them. Volmer looked around, desperate. Then his eyes caught the gas valve on the far wall. Still intact, still pressurized. He whispered to Clara, "When I say run, don't look back." "What are you?" "Run." He kicked over a table, grabbed a flare, and hurled it toward the leaking gas pipe. The explosion tore through the room, swallowing the soldiers in flame. The blast threw Volmer and Clara into the corridor, where they stumbled out, coughing through smoke. "Heinrich!" she shouted, helping him to his feet. His coat was burning. He ripped it off, clutching his ribs in pain. "The serum. It's gone," she said. "All of it." He stared at the collapsing doorway, the fire devouring his life's work. "Then, maybe that's mercy," he whispered. Outside, the morning light broke through the smoke for the first time in days. Berlin was still burning, but the silence that followed felt almost holy. Volmer turned to Clara. "Find the survivors," he said. "Keep them alive. Tell them I wasn't a monster." She gripped his hand tightly. "You're not." He looked toward the sky, the sound of tanks fading into distance. History won't agree. When the smoke cleared, Berlin was a skeleton of its former self. Streets reduced to ashes, sky heavy with the scent of defeat. Heinrich Vollmer and Clara had taken refuge in the basement of an abandoned hospital. The walls cracked, the floors littered with the remains of broken instruments. Outside, the Red Army had declared victory. Inside, the silence of the wounded carried on like an unending prayer. Vollmer sat beside a dying soldier. Not German, not Russian, just another lost boy in a uniform too large for his bones. He cleaned the wound carefully, using nothing but water and cloth now that his formula was gone. "You'll live," he murmured, though he knew the lie in his own words. The boy's eyes fluttered weakly. "Why, help me!" Vollmer hesitated. "Because once I didn't." That answer hung in the air like a confession. He watched as the boy exhaled his final breath, the sound faint but freeing. Every death, every failure, felt like a ledger slowly being balanced. Clara approached quietly, holding a tin of old morphine ampules. "There's not much left." Vollmer nodded. "Then we make it enough." Days turned to weeks. They moved from one ruin to another, patching wounds, feeding orphans, treating whoever still breathed. Germans, Russians, civilians. No sides, just humans. Word began to spread through the rubble. A mysterious doctor healing both friend and foe. Some called him a ghost, others a traitor. Soldiers came searching, but Vollmer always vanished before they arrived. One morning, Clara found him sitting among the ruins of what used to be a church, sketching on scraps of paper. Still working? She asked. He smiled faintly. Always. I'm trying to rewrite what I destroyed. On those papers were not formulas for weapons, but for medicine, vaccines, treatments for burns and infections. The same intellect once used to harm was now rebuilding life. But the past wouldn't stay buried. A Soviet patrol eventually caught them in a bombed-out street. The officer recognized Vollmer's face from a wanted poster. "Dr. Heinrich Vollmer," he said coldly, "you are wanted for war crimes." Clara stepped forward. "He saved lives." The officer raised his hand. "He will answer for what he's done." Vollmer didn't resist. "It's all right," he said softly. "Maybe this is the only way to prove it." They were taken to a makeshift tribunal set up in the heart of the ruined Reich Chancellery. Former Nazis, doctors, and officers were lined up for questioning. Vollmer stood apart, not defiant, not afraid, only tired. The judge read aloud the charges: participation in human experimentation, development of chemical agents, collaboration with the regime. When asked to defend himself, Vollmer simply said, "Everything they claim is true, but it's not the whole truth." Murmurs rippled through the room. "Continue," the judge said. Vollmer took a deep breath. "Yes, I worked for them. I created formulas meant to heal soldiers faster, but the High Command twisted my work. They wanted soldiers who could fight longer, suffer more pain. When I saw what my research had become, I tried to destroy it. They called it betrayal." He looked at the rows of officers staring back at him. "So I betrayed them." He paused. "And now I'm trying to betray my own guilt." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Clara stepped forward, voice trembling but strong. "I saw what he did. He saved children, civilians, Russians, Germans, anyone who needed help. You can hang him, but you can't erase that." The room fell silent. The judge finally said, "The crimes remain, but so does the redemption." Vollmer closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't deny the blood on his hands. He only asked for one thing. "Let her go," he said, nodding to Clara. "She's done nothing wrong." The judge agreed. When the verdict came, imprisonment rather than execution, Vollmer simply bowed his head. "That's fair," he whispered. Outside, Clara waited as soldiers led him away in chains. He turned one last time and said, "Tell them the cure worked." She nodded, tears in her eyes. As the truck drove off, the morning sun rose over Berlin, not warm, not forgiving, but new. The years that followed turned Heinrich Vollmer into a ghost story whispered across the ruins of post-war Europe. Some said he died in a Soviet prison. Others claimed he was taken by the Americans under Operation Paperclip, hidden in the folds of science and secrecy. But the truth, as always, lived quietly. In a small sanatorium on the outskirts of Warsaw, where an aging doctor with trembling hands treated anyone who came to his door. He went by another name now, one that meant nothing to history, but everything to those he saved. His patients called him the man who never asked which flag you served. The world had changed beyond recognition. Nations rebuilt, borders shifted, and the wounds of war turned into monuments of memory. But for Vollmer, every scar he saw was a reminder of his debt, the one he could never repay. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, listening to the soft hum of wind through broken glass, and write letters he'd never send. To his wife, to the soldiers he failed, to the men who died under his research. "If I could speak to them," one letter read, "I'd tell them that science without conscience is just cruelty wearing a white coat." He burned each page after finishing it, the smoke curling upward like his penance carried to heaven. One night, Clara returned, older, thinner, but alive. She had spent years helping the displaced, carrying his methods and his story wherever she went. When she stepped through the door, he froze. For a moment, unable to tell if she was real or another ghost visiting him. "You're still here," she said softly. I had to finish what we started, he replied. She smiled faintly. You already did. They sat in silence, the kind that carried everything words couldn't. Then she handed him a small box. Inside were vials, newly sealed and labeled in her careful handwriting. The formula, she said. I kept your notes. I rebuilt it. Volmer stared in disbelief. You shouldn't have. Someone has to remember what it was meant for, she answered. Not as a weapon, as hope. He took the vial, turning it gently in his fingers. Then hope must survive us both. Days turned to weeks again, and together they began to teach. Local doctors, refugees, anyone willing to learn. The serum became a symbol of healing, not power. Villages started to recover. Epidemics began to fade. It wasn't magic. It was mercy given form. Yet history, as ever, was unkind. When the world discovered his past, whispers resurfaced. That the healer of Warsaw was once the scientist of the Reich. Newspapers printed half-truths. Governments debated his fate. And soldiers came once more to take him away. Clara begged them to listen, but Volmer only raised a hand. Let them come, he said quietly. I've run long enough. He was arrested again, though this time there was no hatred in his eyes, only acceptance. As he was escorted away, a young nurse ran up with tears streaming down her face. Doctor, she said, you saved my brother. He would have died. Volmer stopped and smiled gently. Then my life wasn't wasted. Those were his last recorded words. He died in custody 2 years later, buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. But his formula, the one born in guilt, rebuilt in compassion, survived. It spread across hospitals under different names, used by doctors who never knew its origin. Decades later, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, a nurse lit a candle on her windowsill in his memory. No name, no flag. Just a flame for a man who tried to save his enemies, and, in doing so, found his humanity again. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet hum of a hospital corridor, the echo of his voice still lingers. Science serves life, or it serves nothing at all. History has a cruel habit of remembering monsters more than the men who tried to make amends. Heinrich Vollmer became one of those blurred faces, neither hero nor villain, just a man trapped in the gray fog between sin and salvation. The documents that survived his trials painted him both as a criminal and a visionary. The Soviets called him a traitor to the Reich. The West called him a useful mind. But those who met him in the ashes of Berlin called him something else entirely. A doctor. For decades, his story was sealed behind military archives, buried under classified stamps and denials. Yet his name refused to vanish. In the corridors of post-war medicine, whispers persisted. A German scientist who saved lives without asking who those lives belonged to. His surviving patients remembered his trembling hands and his quiet voice saying, "You deserve to live." It was not redemption, it was reparation in human form. In the chaos of post-war science, others like him escaped judgment through power and politics. Vollmer, however, escaped through service. He worked silently, saving one broken soul at a time, as if trying to balance an equation no nation could solve. Decades later, in 1963, a group of young German students researching medical ethics found fragments of his writings hidden in a Polish archive. One note read, "To heal without asking sides is to remember that life was never the enemy." That single sentence spread among medical circles like a forgotten oath, inspiring new codes of humanitarian medicine. Clara, who outlived him by 20 years, never corrected anyone about his name. When asked who he really was, she would simply say, "He was someone who remembered too late, but remembered completely." She died with one of his vials on her desk, empty, sealed with dust. When Berlin reunited, the sanatorium where they once worked was converted into a memorial clinic for war victims. A plaque near the entrance carried no emblem, no country, just one line engraved in steel. For those who chose to heal, even when the world was breaking. No signature, but anyone who knew, knew. Vollmer's story became part of a quiet movement within post-war ethics. The idea that redemption isn't a gift you receive, it's a duty you perform until your last breath. His formula, now adapted and studied, became the basis of regenerative medicine techniques decades ahead of their time. But he never saw the world acknowledge it. His death remained unmarked, his grave unvisited, his work unlabeled. Yet somehow, his legacy endured, not in books or memorials, but in every doctor who refused to turn away a wounded man, no matter the uniform. In that choice, Vollmer lived on. He became the embodiment of a truth the war had buried, but never killed. That mercy, once discovered, is stronger than any nation's hatred. And in that way, the man once condemned for healing the enemy became, unknowingly, a cornerstone of the future. He may have died forgotten by his time, but time itself remembered him in silence. The world moved on. The science he once created to destroy now saved millions. His name never appeared in textbooks, but his fingerprints were everywhere. In the bandages, in the treatments, in the quiet resolve of those who swore to, first, do no harm. Berlin healed. The scars remained, but so did the lesson he left behind. That even at the heart of humanity's darkest war, one man dared to choose compassion over command. And that choice, though buried in ruin, never died. Years later, a young historian named Elias Reinhardt stumbled upon a rusted metal box buried beneath the rubble of an old Warsaw clinic. Inside were letters, faded, smoke-stained, but intact. Each was signed with the same trembling initials, HV. The handwriting was steady, almost calm, as if written by a man finally at peace with his past. The letters weren't confessions or apologies. They were lessons, reflections on science, guilt, and the price of moral blindness. One line stood out among them. The mind that serves cruelty can never escape it, but it can choose to turn its hands toward healing instead. Elias published the letters decades later, and they quietly reignited debate about morality in wartime science. Universities quoted Vollmer's words in lectures. Doctors spoke of him not as a criminal, but as a cautionary echo of how close genius can come to evil, and how far conscience can pull it back. Yet the man himself remained a mystery. No photograph of his older years survived. No public records confirmed his final resting place. It was as if history itself had agreed to leave him unclaimed. Only one witness remained, an elderly nurse named Marta, who had once worked beside him in those last years of hidden service. When asked what she remembered most, she didn't speak of experiments or medicine. She simply said, "He never stopped listening. Even when no one spoke, he listened." That single memory summed up everything Vollmer had become, a man who had once served tyranny and ended by serving silence, letting his actions speak instead. In the years following the fall of the Berlin Wall, a group of medical volunteers named their new humanitarian foundation the Vollmer Initiative. Its mission was simple: to bring healing where hatred once reigned. The founders never confirmed whether they believed the legend was real. They didn't have to. The name itself had become symbolic, a ghostly reminder that compassion born in darkness is still compassion. On the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a candlelight vigil was held in Berlin for unnamed healers of the war. Among the flickering lights, one small plaque carried the inscription, "To the scientist who saved his enemies." No one spoke his name aloud, but everyone understood whose story it was. As the crowd dispersed, a young boy asked his grandfather, "Was he real?" The old man smiled faintly. "If mercy is real, then yes, so was he." The boy nodded, staring at the candlelight reflecting on the monument's steel. Then I'll remember him. And perhaps that was the truest ending Heinrich Vollmer could ever have hoped for. Not absolution. Not fame, but remembrance in the heart of someone untouched by war. Someone who could see beyond flags and borders and simply say, "He healed." As the wind swept through the silent square that night, the flames danced as though answering back. Somewhere beyond history's reach, Vollmer's ghost might have smiled, finally unburdened, finally free. Because in the end, the man who tried to save his enemies had done something far greater. He had reminded the world that even in its darkest hour, humanity could still choose light.